Excel has a feature that helps you quickly create a pivot table from your data called the Recommended PivotTables command. Excel analyzes your data and provides suggestions to quickly create a pivot table from the data. So how do you create a pivot table using the Recommended PivotTables icon? First, you need a data source for the pivot table to reference. The data source can be any list of data. The only thing you need to have in your data is a column that has repeating values. You could create a pivot table from data that didn't have repeating values, but if you did that, you'd get all the same data in the pivot table as you had in the data source because there's no way to summarize or group the data. Having a repeating value in one of the columns of the data source gives you something to summarize the data on. So let me show you how to create a pivot table using the Recommended PivotTables icon. To create the pivot table, you would select any cell within the data source. Click the Insert tab on the command ribbon. Click the Recommended PivotTables icon. The Recommended PivotTables dialog box shows a list of suggested pivot tables on the left and a slightly larger preview of the selected pivot table on the right. Once you've selected the pivot table you want to add, click OK to create the pivot table on a new worksheet. Just like that, you have a pivot table. The pivot table was created on a new worksheet. I want to move it to the worksheet that contains the data source so that you can compare the pivot table to the data source. To move a pivot table to another worksheet in the workbook, you would select any cell in the pivot table, click the Pivot Table Analyze tab on the command ribbon, click the Move Pivot Table icon. Existing worksheet and the location text are already selected, so you just click the Worksheet tab and the cell within that worksheet where you want to move the pivot table, and then click OK. Now we can see the pivot table and the data source. I'll just make the pivot table's text a little larger so we can see it better. If you compare the data in the pivot table to the data in the data source, you'll see that each row in the pivot table displays a unique region name in the first column and the total number of locations for that region in the second column. There are many things you can do with a pivot table. If you'd like to learn more about pivot tables, check out some of my other videos.